The silver-tipped whip sang a high, cruel note before it bit into the meat of my shoulder, the scent of my own scorched skin rising to meet the freezing mountain air like a prayer no god would ever answer. I didn't scream. I had learned years ago that silence was the only thing I truly owned in the Black Ridge Pack, a currency of spite I spent sparingly while the Alpha's shadow loomed over me, smelling of stale cedar and the metallic tang of a dying winter. The pack gathered in a circle of amber eyes and bared teeth, their breath huffing out in rhythmic plumes of white mist, a collective heartbeat that pulsed with the singular desire to see the Barren Bitch finally broken. My knees hit the permafrost, the jagged ice slicing through my thin shift, but I kept my spine straight, as my gaze fixed on the horizon where the moon hung heavy and bloated, a pale eye watching my disgrace. This was the tithe of the unclaimed, a ritual for those of us who had reached our 25th year without shifting, without a mate, and, most unforgivably in the eyes of Alpha Silas, without the scent of fertility that usually clung to a wolf like a musk. Still silent, Elara? Silas's voice was a low rumble, a tectonic shift of rock and resentment that vibrated in my very marrow. He stepped into the light of the ceremonial braziers, his massive frame draped in the pelt of a rival he'd slaughtered a decade ago, the fur matted with old blood, and the lingering arrogance of a man who believed he could command the stars to stop their turning. He gripped my chin, his fingers like iron talons, forcing me to look into his eyes. Eyes that held no mercy, only the cold calculation of a breeder who had found his stock defective. You are a drain on our resources, a ghost haunting the halls of your betters. Your father was a lead warrior, yet you carry the womb of a stone. Tell me, why should I not cast you into the ravine of the forgotten tonight? I tasted copper as I bit my tongue, the heat of the mating bond, or rather, the lack thereof, aching like a phantom limb. In our world, the bond was everything. It was the tether to the Great Spirit, the fire that fueled the shift, the promise of a lineage that would outlast the creeping rot of the human cities. To be without it was to be a hollow reed, easily snapped. I looked past him, at the high, jagged peaks where the Shadow King was said to roam, the Alpha of Alphas, whose name was only whispered when the wind howled too loudly. They called him Valerius, the ruin of the north, a wolf so ancient and powerful that his very presence was said to turn the air to ozone and the earth to glass. He was the bogeyman Silas used to frighten the pups. Yet in this moment of my ultimate degradation, I found myself wishing for his darkness to swallow us all. I have no words for a man who measures a woman's worth by the blood she spills on the birthing bed, I spat, the words raspy and raw. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of air that made the torches flicker. Silas's face contorted, the skin over his cheekbones tightening as he prepared to deliver a blow that would likely end my life. He didn't use the whip this time. He used his hand, a heavy, devastating strike that sent me spinning into the dirt, the world blurring into a kaleidoscope of gray snow and red pain. I lay there for a moment, the side of my face pressed against the frozen earth, listening to the thrum of the mountain. And then I heard it. It wasn't a sound, but a vibration. A low, rhythmic thrumming that seemed to originate from the very core of the planet. It was the sound of a heartbeat, but it wasn't mine, and it certainly wasn't Silas's. It was vast, echoing, and terrifyingly close. The wolves around me began to whine, their ears flattening against their skulls, their tails tucking between their legs, in an instinctive display of submission that I had never seen from the proud warriors of Black Ridge. The air grew heavy, the pressure in my ears building until I thought my eardrums would burst. Then came the scent. It didn't smell like the pine and wet dog of our pack. It smelled of ancient forests, of ozone after a lightning strike, of crushed violets and the deep, cold musk of a predator that had hunted the world when it was still dreaming of fire. It was the scent of power, absolute and unyielding. "Silas," a voice echoed, though no one had spoken. It was a telepathic roar that shattered the glass of our collective consciousness, a command that brought every wolf to their knees in an instant. The shadows at the edge of the clearing began to bleed forward, thickening into a physical presence that swallowed the light of the braziers. From the darkness stepped a figure that made Silas look like a whimpering pup. He was tall, his skin the color of moonlit marble, his hair a shock of midnight silk that fell over eyes of burning, or molten gold. He wasn't wearing a shirt, and his chest was a map of silver scars and shifting ink, tattoos that seemed to writhe and howl under his skin. This was Valerius, the Shadow King. He didn't walk. He glided, the snow beneath his bare feet not even crunching, as if the elements themselves were afraid to impede his progress. Silas was trembling, his hands shaking as he pressed his forehead to the ice. "Lord Valerius, we did not expect. The tribute is not yet ready." Valerius ignored him, his golden gaze sweeping over the cowering wolves until it landed on me. I was still sprawled in the dirt, blood trickling from my lip, my shift torn and stained. I expected disgust. I expected the same dismissal I had received from my pack since the day I turned 18 and failed to shift. Instead, I saw a flash of something that looked like recognition, and then a fury so cold it threatened to flash freeze the very air in my lungs. "You strike what is mine." Valerius's voice was a whisper now, but it carried the weight of a mountain. He was standing over me, his shadow falling across my broken form like a protective shroud. The heat radiating from him was intense, a localized summer in the heart of the Arctic. "Yours?" Silas stammered, his voice cracking. "She is Elara, a defective. She is infertile, a low-ranking Omega who cannot even shift. She is a disgrace to the species." Valerius moved so fast the eye couldn't follow. One moment he was standing, and the next he had Silas by the throat, hoisting the massive alpha off the ground with a single hand. The sound of Silas's windpipe, whistling for air, was the only noise in the clearing. Valerius leaned in, his teeth bared in a snarl that revealed canines far longer and sharper than any normal wolf's. "She is the fated mate of the High King," Valerius hissed, the words vibrating through my bones. "She is the vessel of the eternal lineage. And you have laid hands upon her." The shock that rippled through me was more painful than the whip. Fated mate? Me? The girl who had been poked and prodded by pack healers for years, told her internal organs were quiet as a tomb, told her scent was neutral and useless. I looked up at the man holding my alpha like a rag doll, searching for the lie, but I found only a terrifying, possessive truth. The bond, which had been a dull ache my whole life, suddenly roared to life, a white-hot bridge of fire connecting my heart to his. It was so intense I gasped, my back arching off the snow as a dormant power began to stir in the base of my spine, a coiled serpent of heat that had been waiting for its master's touch to wake. Valerius tossed Silas aside like trash, the alpha crashing into a stack of ceremonial logs with a sickening crunch of bone. Valerius didn't spare him another glance. He knelt in the snow beside me, his movements suddenly fluid and gentle. His large, calloused hand reached out, hovering just inches from my bruised cheek. "Little spark," he murmured, his voice no longer a roar, but a caress that made my skin tingle. "They have kept you in the dark, haven't they? They fed you lies to keep your fire from burning their house down." I can't shift," I whispered. I've the words a confession of my deepest shame. "I am empty. There is nothing inside me." A dark, knowing smile touched his lips. "There is a kingdom inside you, Elara. You couldn't shift because a common wolf's skin could never contain the soul of a queen. You were waiting for me. You were waiting for the blood of the primals to unlock the gate." He leaned down and pressed his forehead against mine. The moment our skin met, the world exploded. It wasn't a shift. It was an awakening. I felt my bones crack and reform, not into the shape of a wolf, but into something older, larger and infinitely more dangerous. My vision flooded with colors I didn't have names for. The ultraviolet of the wind, the deep crimson of the earth's pulse. The silver in the whip marks on my back began to smoke and dissolve, the wounds knitting together until only smooth, unblemished skin remained. But it wasn't just my body changing. It was the void within me. For years I had felt like a hollow vessel, a bell that wouldn't ring. Now I felt a surge of golden light settle in my womb, a weight that was both heavy and buoyant. It was a spark of life so potent it made the grass beneath me push through the snow in a frantic, impossible burst of green. Valerius pulled back, his eyes searching mine. They call you useless, because they fear what they cannot control. They see a barren field, where I see the cradle of the next age. He stood and offered me his hand. Behind him, the Black Ridge pack remained prostrate, the terror in the air thick enough to taste. Silas was coughing up blood, his eyes wide with a realization that came far too late. I looked at the hand, large, powerful, stained with the history of 1,000 battles. And then I looked at the pack that had tormented me. I felt no pity. I felt only a cold, crystalline clarity. I took his hand. The heat of his palm was a revelation. It wasn't just warmth. It was an anchor. As he pulled me to my feet, the thin shift I wore fell away, replaced by a cloak of shadows that Valerius seemed to weave out of the very night air. It draped over my shoulders, heavy and smelling of him, a physical manifestation of his claim. "We leave," Valerius announced, his voice carrying to the furthest reaches of the valley. "And if any wolf of this pack ever crosses the border of the Shadow Realm, I will not just kill them. I will erase their very lineage from the great song." He turned me toward the mountains, his arm wrapping around my waist, or pulling me flush against his side. I could feel the hard muscle of his thigh, the steady drum of his heart against my ribs. I was a head shorter than him, yet as we walked through the ranks of the kneeling wolves, I felt like a giant. We passed my father's old cabin, a dilapidated shack that held nothing but memories of hunger and cold, and I didn't even look back. As we reached the edge of the clearing, the shadows deepened, rising up like a tidal wave to consume us. I felt a momentary sensation of weightlessness, the world spinning into a vortex of black and gold, and then the air changed. The biting chill of the Black Ridge was gone, replaced by a lush, damp warmth that felt like a lungful of life. We were standing on a balcony of obsidian, overlooking a city that defied the laws of physics. It was carved directly into the face of a massive canyon, the buildings glowing with an internal violet light, connected by bridges of woven moonlight. Huge, winged shapes soared through the mist below, and the air was filled with a low-frequency hum that sounded like 1,000 wolves howling in harmony. "Welcome to the Umbra Throne," Valerius said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. He didn't let go of me. Instead, he turned me to face him, his hands sliding up to cup my face. His thumbs traced the line of my jaw, his touch light as a feather, yet heavy with intent. "Here, you are not a tithe. You are the law." I looked into his golden eyes and saw not a king, but a man who had been searching for a missing piece of himself for a very long time. "Why me?" I asked, my voice finally finding its strength. "Out of all the fertile she-wolves, all the high-born daughters of the great packs, why the one they threw away?" Valerius leaned in, his breath warm against my ear. "Because the Great Spirit does not give the most precious seeds to the softest earth, Elara. She gives them to the soil that has been tempered by the frost, to the land that knows how to hold onto life when everything else has withered. You are not barren. You are a sanctuary. And within you, the king of the new world is already beginning to dream." He kissed me then, and it wasn't the tentative kiss of a suitor. It was a conquest. It was the taste of salt and storm, of ancient promises, and a future written in fire. As his tongue danced with mine, I felt that golden spark in my womb flare into a sun, the heat of it radiating outward until my very skin began to glow. Well, I wasn't just a fated mate. I was a weapon. And as I clung to the Shadow King, the obsidian balcony beneath us vibrating with the force of our union, I knew that the Black Ridge Pack would soon learn that the most dangerous thing in the world is a woman who has been given back her soul. Valerius pulled away, his eyes dark with a hunger that made my knees weak. "You are tired," he said, though I felt more alive than I ever had. "The awakening takes much from the body. Come. There is a bath of cedar and crushed pearls waiting for you, and a bed of fur from the great bears of the west. Tomorrow we begin the rite of the blood moon." "The rite?" I asked, allowing him to lead me through the massive obsidian doors into a bedchamber that was larger than the entirety of my father's house. "The formal recognition of our bond," he explained, his fingers already working the clasp of the shadow cloak he had given me. "The pack must see the mark. They must see that the queen has returned. But tonight—" He paused, his gaze dropping to my stomach, his hand splaying across the flat plane of my belly. "Tonight is for us, and for the heir who has waited 1,000 years to be born." As he led me toward the massive, fur-draped bed, I caught a glimpse of myself in a mirror of polished silver. I didn't recognize the woman looking back. Her eyes were no longer a dull, defeated brown. They were flecked with gold, the same gold that burned in Valerius's gaze. The bruises were gone, replaced by a radiant, ethereal glow that seemed to emanate from deep within my marrow. I looked powerful. I looked lethal. I looked like a mother of kings. The bed was a sea of softness, the furs cool against my heated skin. Valerius joined me, his massive frame a comforting weight, his scent wrapping around me like a physical embrace. I laid my head on his chest, listening to the slow, steady beat of his heart, and for the first time in my life the world felt quiet. The voices of the pack, the insults, the sting of the whip, it all faded into a distant, insignificant hum. But as I drifted toward sleep, a new sensation took hold. It was a faint, rhythmic pulsing deep within me, a second heartbeat that was out of sync with my own. It was small, no larger than a grain of sand, yet it possessed a gravity that felt like it could pull the stars from the sky. I wasn't useless. I wasn't empty. I was a vessel for the greatest power the shifter world had ever known, and as I finally surrendered to the dark, I felt a surge of fierce, protective love for the tiny life beginning to take root in the barren soil of my body. The Shadow King's heir was coming, and the world was not ready for the storm we were about to unleash. The silence of the bedchamber was not the silence of a void, but the heavy, expectant hush of a cathedral before the first note of an organ shatters the air. Valerius's arm was a warm bar of iron across my waist, his breathing rhythmic and deep, yet I remained suspended in the amber of wakefulness, tethered to the strange, insistent thrumming in my lower belly. It felt like a heartbeat made of liquid gold, a pulse that didn't just move blood, but moved the very fabric of my soul. I reached down, my fingers trembling as they brushed the silk of my night shift, pressing against the skin that Silas had mocked as hollow. Beneath the surface, the heat was undeniable. A localized summer that defied the obsidian chill of the mountain. I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I didn't see the dark. I saw a sprawling, ancient consciousness that felt like it was looking back at me. It wasn't the mind of a babe, but a primordial force, a kingly essence that had waited in the ether for a vessel strong enough to anchor it to the physical plane. I realized then why the healers of my old pack had found nothing. They were looking for a flickering candle, and I was a furnace designed to house a star. The realization brought a jagged, poetic justice to my throat. They had discarded the crown because they were too blind to see the gold in the ore. A low growl vibrated through Valerius's chest, though he did not wake. His wolf was near the surface, sensing the shift in my internal tide. The bond between us was no longer a mere connection. It was a conduit, a raging river of power that he was pouring into me even in his sleep. I could feel his strength, the memories of 1,000 winters, the scent of 1,000,000 fallen foes, bleeding into my marrow, strengthening the walls of my womb to hold the weight of what was coming. It was a symbiotic consumption. He gave me his divinity, and I gave his lineage a doorway into the world. As the first light of the blood moon began to bleed through the high, arched windows, staining the obsidian floors a bruised purple, I felt a sudden, sharp contraction. It wasn't pain, not yet, but a violent rearranging of my atoms. My skin began to itch with a phantom fur, and the scent of the room amplified until I could smell the individual grains of dust and the metallic tang of the mountain's veins. I sat up, my breath hitching, and watched as my shadow on the wall began to lengthen and distort, growing ears that were too long, and a muzzle that looked like a jagged blade. "It begins," Valerius whispered. I hadn't heard him move, but he was awake, his eyes two glowing embers in the twilight of the room. He sat up behind me, his chest pressing against my back, his hands sliding over my shoulders to steady me. "The Heir is calling for his cloak. He is demanding that you show the world what you have become." "I feel like I'm breaking," I gasped, the heat in my gut turning into a white-hot roar that threatened to consume my lungs. "You are not breaking, Elara," he murmured, his teeth grazing the sensitive cord of my neck, sending a jolt of electricity through my spine. "You are unfolding. The barren girl is the cocoon. The queen is the butterfly with teeth. Let it out. Don't fight the hunger." I threw my head back, my spine popping in a rapid-fire succession of sounds, like dry wood snapping in a gale. The scream that tore from my throat wasn't human. It was a multifaceted howl that contained the grief of my past and the predatory promise of my future. The room dissolved into a blur of motion and scent as the first true shift took hold, not of a common wolf, but of something ancient, something that had been erased from the history books by men who feared the dark. I felt my claws tip with silver and my heart expand until it beat with the force of a drum made of thunder. The world didn't just change. It shattered and reassembled itself in a kaleidoscope of predatory clarity. My human senses had been a muffled veil, a thick wool wrapping my soul, but now the veil was shredded. I could hear the rhythmic dripping of a stalactite 3 chambers away, the frantic heartbeat of a nesting nighthawk in the rafters, and the slow, heavy thrum of the mountain's tectonic shifting. My skin didn't just grow fur. It erupted in a coat of midnight silk, each hair tipped with a silver frost that hummed with static. I was no longer the small, broken thing that Silas had discarded in the snow. I was a creature of shadow and sinew, my limbs elongated into powerful levers of destruction, my ribcage expanding to house a heart that beat for 2. Valerius was there, his own form shifting in sympathy, though he remained in his semi-human state, his eyes burning like twin suns in the violet gloom. He reached out, his hand, now tipped with obsidian talons, running down the length of my new spine. The touch was electric, a grounding wire for the storm raging inside me. I turned my head, my muzzle long and elegant, and let out a low, huffing breath that smelled of ancient cedar and the metallic tang of the stars. I felt the weight of the air within me, a golden anchor that kept my wolf soul from drifting into the mindless void of the hunt. The babe was a silent conductor, directing the flow of my transformation, demanding a vessel that was not just strong, but indestructible. "Look at you," Valerius whispered, his voice a vibration that I felt more than heard through my sensitive ears. "They called you a stone. They had no idea they were holding a diamond that could cut their throats." I stepped off the bed, my paws silent on the obsidian floor, feeling the ripple of muscle under my pelt. I felt a sudden ravenous hunger, not just for meat, but for acknowledgement. The pack outside, The thousands of shadow wolves who called this canyon home, they needed to see. They needed to know that the throne was no longer solitary. I moved toward the balcony, my movement a fluid, haunting glide that felt more like floating than walking. The air outside was crisp, carrying the scent of 1,000 different lives, and as I stepped into the moonlight, the blood moon caught the silver in my fur, making me glow like a ghost. A low, collective gasp rose from the city below. Thousands of eyes turned upward, a sea of amber and gold reflecting the lunar light. These were not the cowering, malnourished wolves of the Black Ridge. These were the elite, the Nightmare Guard, the survivors of 100 wars. And yet, as I stood there, a wolf of impossible proportions and ethereal light, I felt them bow. It started near the palace gates and rippled outward like a wave, a silent physical surrender to the power emanating from my womb. They didn't bow to me because I was Valerius's mate. They bowed because they could feel the king of the new world stirring within the barren girl. The rite of the blood moon is not just a ceremony, Elara, Valerius said, appearing at my side, his presence a towering wall of heat. It is a challenge. There are those in the High Council who believe a wolf of common blood, even a fated one, cannot carry the weight of the primal spark. They will seek to test your marrow. They will seek to see if the air is a fluke of the moon or a decree of the fates. I looked down at the sprawling city, at the violet lights and the ancient stone, and I felt a cold, sharp smile stretch across my wolf face. The air within me kicked, a solid, powerful strike that sent a surge of adrenaline through my veins. The heavy obsidian doors at the back of the chamber groaned open, the sound like a grinding of tectonic plates. I didn't need to turn my head to know who entered. My new senses painted a vivid picture of the 3 figures stepping into the moonlight. They smelled of old parchment, dried hemlock, and a stagnant, suffocating arrogance. These were the High Council, the elders who had governed the Shadow Realm while Valerius waged his wars on the borders of the world. They were ancient. Their human forms gnarled like the roots of a dying oak, their eyes filmed over with the milky cataracts of centuries, yet their power was a palpable pressure, a psychic weight that sought to bow my head. "A beautiful facade, my king," the eldest spoke, his voice a dry rasp that sounded like dead leaves skittering across a grave. He was known as Malphus, a wolf who had forgotten the taste of blood in favor of the taste of influence. He stepped forward, his gaze raking over my silver-tipped fur with a clinical, insulting detachment. A striking transformation, to be sure. But a shift does not equate to a legacy. The great song requires harmony, not just a loud note. You bring a woman from the dregs of the Black Ridge, a known baron, and expect us to believe the primal spark has chosen such a fractured vessel. Valerius stiffened beside me, a low, tectonic growl vibrating in his throat that made the very floorboards tremble. "Careful, Malphus," he warned, his voice a silk-wrapped blade. "The Great Spirit does not consult the Council before she writes the fates. You see a fracture. I see a crucible." "The Council sees a risk," a woman interjected, her voice like the chime of cold crystal. This was Hestia, the weaver of bloodlines. She wore robes of deep crimson that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. She approached me, her hand outstretched as if to touch my flank, but I bared my teeth, a guttural warning echoing from the depths of my chest. She paused, her eyes narrowing. If the girl is truly the vessel of the king's heir, her blood will answer the call of the ancestors. If she is an impostor, a fluke of a desperate bond, the call will hollow her out until there is nothing left but ash. I felt the golden spark within me surge, a hot, defiant coal that burned against the cold skepticism of the room. They wanted a test. They wanted to see if the infertile girl would crumble under the weight of their scrutiny. I shifted back, the transition from wolf to woman seamless and agonizingly beautiful, the shadow cloak weaving itself around my naked skin before the first eye could glimpse my vulnerability. I stood tall, my feet bare on the cold stone, my eyes locked on Malthus. "You speak of harmony, Elder," I said, my voice steady, carrying a resonance I hadn't possessed hours ago. "But you have lived so long in the silence of your halls that you have forgotten what the music of life sounds like. You call me a risk. I call myself the inevitable." Hestia stepped forward, pulling a dagger of pure, translucent glass from her sleeve. "Then let the blood speak, Elara of the Black Ridge. The rite of the blood moon requires a drop of the mother's essence to be offered to the altar of the first alpha. If the Heir is true, the altar will glow with the dawn. If not," she let the sentence hang, the threat as sharp as the glass in her hand. I didn't wait for Valerius to defend me. I stepped toward her, reaching out and grasping the blade by the edge. The glass bit into my palm, and as the first drop of my blood hit the floor, it didn't soak into the stone. It hissed, turning into a bead of molten gold that rolled toward the center of the room, leaving a trail of scorched earth in its wake. The elders recoiled, their masks of indifference shattering as the room began to fill with the scent of ozone and blooming jasmine. The bead of my blood did not merely roll, it hunted. It sought the ancient altar of the first alpha, a monolith of uncarved starstone that sat at the heart of the chamber, pulsating with a dormant, gravitational pull. When the golden drop touched the porous surface, the reaction was instantaneous and violent. A pillar of white fire erupted, piercing the vaulted ceiling and connecting the earth to the bloated belly of the blood moon above. The elders fell back, their frail hands shielding eyes that had seen centuries, but never a miracle of this magnitude. Malthus's arrogant sneer dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror as the room filled with the spectral baying of 1,000 ancestor wolves, a chorus of the dead welcoming the king of the living. I felt the power of the altar rush back into me through the cut in my palm, a feedback loop of divinity that made my veins glow like incandescent filaments. I was no longer just Elara. I was the bridge between the forgotten past and the terrifying future. Valerius stepped to my side, his hand covering mine on the altar, his touch the only thing keeping me grounded as the sheer velocity of the Heir's magic threatened to lift me into the air. Together, we were a storm system, a binary star of shadow and gold that rendered the High Council's petty politics as insignificant as dust motes in a gale.
"Do you see now?"
Valerius's voice was the thunder that followed the lightning of the altar's flare. "She is the soil, she is the seed, and she is the harvest. To question her is to question the Great Spirit herself." Hestia fell to her knees, the glass dagger shattering against the floor as she bowed her head. The crimson of her robes seemed dull and faded against the brilliance of my skin. One by one, the other elders followed, their spines bending under the weight of a truth they could no longer deny. The Barren Bitch of the Black Ridge was gone, consumed by the fire of the fated bond, and replaced by a matriarch whose name would be etched into the stars long after their bones had turned to silt. I looked out over the balcony once more, the pillar of light from the altar reflecting off the obsidian towers of the city. The howl that rose from the millions below was no longer a sound of submission, but a war cry of celebration. They knew. The mountain knew. The very air knew that the lineage of the Shadow King had been secured not by a high-born warrior, but by the one the world had forgotten to watch. I felt a kick from within, not a flutter, but a rhythmic, demanding thud that echoed the heartbeat of the world. The Heir was restless. He was ready to inherit a kingdom that would never again doubt the strength of the woman who bore him. Valerius pulled me into his arms, his forehead resting against mine, his eyes swimming with a fierce, possessive love that was more intoxicating than any wine. The pain of the whip, the cold of the snow, and the years of loneliness were all burned away in the furnace of his gaze. We were the beginning of something that would never end, a cycle of blood and shadow that would rewrite the laws of the wild. I reached up, tracing the silver scars on his chest, my fingers finally stilling over his heart. I thought of the whip's song and the scent of my own scorched skin that had started this night, and I realized that every agony had been a necessary tempering. The silver-tipped lash had not been my ending. It had been the striking of the flint. I leaned into him, my voice a low, poetic promise that vibrated against his skin. The scent of silver and pine was still there, but now it was overlaid with the intoxicating heat of a wolf's breath and the heavy, eternal weight of the mating bond. I closed my eyes as the moon reached its zenith, the golden light of my womb finally silencing the ghosts of my past. They thought I was infertile and useless, until I birthed the Alpha King's fated heir, and the world learned that a stone only bleeds when it is destined to become a crown.